profesyonel gelişimler üzerine çalışıyor. Kendisi özellikle alan bilgisi ve pedagojik alan bilgisi çalışmalarıyla tanınan bir akademisyen. Bugün bizlere Evidence-Based Practice for Physical Education, What Works and Meaningful, yani beden eğitimi için kanıta dayalı uygulamalar ne işe yarar ve anlamlı olan nedir diye bir sunum hazırladı kendisine. Sunum sonrası sorularınız olursa birlikteyiz. Thank you very much, Dr. Moore. We are ready for listening to you.
Şu başlat. Sigarayı yere mi çıkmıyor? Şarjaletin de alabilirsin. Şarjı nerede şarjı? Bir kaldı bende bak. O da bana kaldı.
The title of its talk, if you were looking for lists of evidence-based practices. I'm going to talk today a lot about what makes a practice evidence-based and how that can be interpreted in the Meaningful PE framework. That said, let's get going. I'd like to thank the organising committee of the conference for the invitation to talk here at Turkey. I'm honoured and delighted to give this talk. I gave my first talk in Istanbul in 2005 and then in Antalya in 2010 and 2016, and the last one was, I think, last year. I apologise I cannot be with you in person, but I'm delighted to be able to share. I'd like to, as I said, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be here today, and I must extend, as always, a very thank you to all my very many friends in Turkey, whom I continue to do research with and communicate almost on a weekly basis. It's always been my privilege to work with you all. In short, I have a long and very positive relationship with Turkey. My audience today is essentially teacher educators, teachers, and to a lesser extent pre-service teachers, but pre-service teachers will there's information here for them to use. I want to start by talking about my physical education philosophy. I've started doing this more and more because so many folks have very different views of how they see physical education, and it is not a case of agreeing with me, but simply to know where I'm coming from. I think speakers have an obligation to make it clear what they view physical education as, given the discourse that has a lot of variance in it. Very simply, I think the primary outcome of physical education is to produce joy in moving, in particular by moving competently. I say this because in my experience as both a researcher, most curriculums, most instructional models don't survive for a very long time. I've observed a large number of models implemented in the United States: sport education, teaching games for understanding, teaching personal responsibility models, district-wide professional development, and they're for the most part very all short-lived. And it's been my observation that is mostly true, some exceptions to that, but mostly true around the world. Because of this, my primary theme today, which I'll talk about in a moment, is going to be teachers rather than instructional methods or curriculum or other aspects of physical education. My other point that I want to make is that, from my perspective, all other objectives in physical education are supportive of one thing: helping children move and to move successfully so they can find joy in moving. I agree, as I'll mention again in a few minutes, that fun and delight, as meaningful PE people talk about it, are distinctly different, and delight is synonymous to me with joy. However, joy of movement can only be achieved, I think, if you're competent. I don't think you can experience joy without some movement competency. If you think of young children running across a field, there's joy there, but only because they can run effectively across the field. Having a volleyball rally, even if you lose the rally, there's a lot of joy in the performance that you're able to sustain the rally. It's better if you win, I agree. However, a common outcome in teaching physical education around the world is that students do not become skillful in this content they learn, nor do they learn effectively the social skills and playing social skills, such as calling for the play and calling for the ball, etc., or knowledgeable in the content that is taught. I have, I think, data from more than 20,000 pre-service teachers in their first year of teaching that shows that on average, the typical student who wants to come into physical education, whether they're in Turkey, Belgium, China, Japan, America, any of the countries, France, Germany, that they have the skill set of about 60% of what you would expect them to learn if they were in physical education. So if we're talking soccer and you listed out all the things you would like students to have learned in their K-12 in this schooling experience, we have consistently found there are very, very few students who are more than 60% competent at performing and even less knowing the content. And that's soccer, which is a very popular sport. If I were to use that data with tennis, it would be very low. Basketball is about the same as soccer. And so we conclude from this that K-12 physical education is not particularly effective at teaching movements as well as we think it might. There are a number of reasons for this, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But the bigger problem here is this denies children and young adults access to an opportunity to experience joy and thus meaningfulness in physical education. And this has an impact in their sustained engagement in physical education or movement across their lifespan. I remember the SPARK study that Tom McKenzie was part of, and Jim Salas in the early 80s and 90s. And what was interesting is they did the most extensive follow-up. They drove miles if students moved from the school to another school to see if they engaged in out-of-school physical activity of whatever kind, walking, playing a pickup game, or enrolled in regular sport. And the SPARK studies, which were very well conducted, utterly failed to show out-of-school physical activity impact. And I've not seen a lot of studies that have shown that curriculums, instructional methods really transfer the way we think they transfer out of school. And one potential reason for this is students might not be as competent as we think they are when we send them out of school to do activity. And one major reason for this is both the teaching and the content they learn, but it's also how much sustained involvement they have in an instructional unit. Peter Hastie and I have for more than 30 years, along with a number of other researchers, argued aggressively that instructional units in secondary PE need to be at least 20 days long, or else you can't really learn the movements that you're trying to teach. And certainly not just learning the movements, but being able to incorporate them into games that students could feel competent enough to play and enjoy. Tim Fletcher, in his abstract for this conference, suggested that that a lot of people think meaningful PE is good teaching. I I'm one of them, but I agree with Tim that the distinction lies in the explicit and intentional use of meaningful experiences. I'm going to talk more about that also in a few minutes. But I think it's very clear that most people understand that good teaching is not merely the successful teaching of motor skills. It's all-encompassing in terms of the whole child, but is not over-encompassing in that there's content that is physical education related if it's movement focused, that is the core of the content to be taught. There are some people who feel that that it's not movement, that it's physical activity. Others feel that it's social skills. All legitimately good outcomes in my view, but different than the movement outcome. And the movement outcome is physical education is the only subject matter in schools that addresses movement. The reason that's so important is that most of the academics have to do with work in one's life, and physical activity, physical education, deals with the leisure or recreational part, what I would call the play in one's life. And there should be a subject matter that addresses that. Physical education, in my view, is that subject matter. I just want to talk a little bit here about my interpretation of Tim Fletcher's model here. The social interaction, I think, is perfectly legitimate. I don't think we have done a good job in teacher education at helping to train pre-service teachers to encourage social interaction in their classes. If I look at just one variable, such as the skill of questioning students, it's very hard to find explicit instruction in a teacher education program that focuses on questioning. The Just Right challenge, my interpretation is going to be a little bit different on some of these things than what Tim and others have got here, but Just Right is the pitch of the instructional task to me, and I'm drawing on Barrick Rosenshine at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, back in the day, when he said you need to pitch things at about 85%, so that there's about a 15% error rate. Very few people have addressed that in the literature, but in study after study, that 85% comes up in maths, science, and certainly in physical education. It was the criteria in academic learning time, an instrument used to measure student engagement in physical education in our field. The 85% is a good benchmark to go for. It tends to happen that when you drop below 85% success rate, students take longer to acquire the skill, and that impacts their persistence with the task and their motivation. Personally relevant learning, I can't think of anything that's been so understated as the prior knowledge of the prior knowledge of the student that is known by the teacher. Understanding what students know when you teach is critically important, and in teacher education, I don't think we have done a good job of talking about that as much as we should. I think many people do, but not to the depth that we might do. I myself have only ever just handed out notes to students when I've taught, asking them to answer a couple of questions about the sports they've enjoyed and what they found most useful and what they think they're good at, and following that with conversations in the closure of lessons. But we need to do far more, I think, in connecting what students do in physical education to the larger situated environment they find themselves in. Delight, I just view that as joy, and I've already talked about the importance of joy. Fun, I agree here. Students should have fun in doing physical education, but for many students, if they're learning a fitness unit or a unit that they're not keen on, I'm not sure that they have as much fun as we think they might do. And I do believe fun is not present. The other point in a lot of physical education, and when you have roll out the ball environments, I think you have a lot of fun, not much learning, not much joy, and those things tend not to be sustained. For example, in a high school physical education lesson in volleyball in the United States, when I've researched these in different locales across the United States, I have found that students spend their level of physical activity is more devoted to chasing the ball because it was hit with one arm than engaging in successful performance of the task. Students laughing at each other, laughing at the fact someone has to chase the ball. This is not the fun that I think anyone is talking about when we talk about fun in physical education. And fun, I think, is also tied very much to social interaction. Motor competence I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. I have very clear views. I think I might be an outlier in the field about motor competence, but I have, again, substantive studies, thousands of students showing that we can produce motor competence and most of these other issues. Well, I don't have data on personally relevant learning or direct measures on fun and delight. I've got some qualitative indicators of those things. But my central theme today is that teaching is powerful and that teachers must take responsibility for exercising their impact on students. And doing so involves intentionally considering and working on making physical education meaningful. Now, when I started my career, I was very clear that teachers, this was the view I had of teachers. And I can tell you that for the last 25 years or so, I have not put teachers front and center on this stuff. I've laid the blame more at teacher education, and I've laid the blame for poor teaching more on the conditions that teachers work in. However, I recently gave a talk to about 100 physical education teachers on professional development, and I suggested to them that they need to be very aggressive in developing their own professional development. I asked them to consider what was the best professional development they had done, and I suggested to them that most often, and this was the case, it was stuff that they went after because they were very interested in it. In my own research, that is exactly what I found, and in others' research. People were interested in elementary school in movement, say Laban's movement if they weren't taught it, and they went after studying it. They became experts in the area. Outdoor education, this was something I know that is big in Turkey. They went after it and learned from other people rather than necessarily at a conference, though conferences and other forms of professional development, formal professional development are good ways to learn. So I want to suggest that teaching is powerful. My reason for doing this is that when teaching is powerful, the results are seriously significant for children. It's powerful when it is effective, that is, children learn, when it is caring, that teachers care about the people they're teaching, and it is meaningful. Students connect with the situated nature of the activity they're engaged in. Now, I know that effective and caring are also part of meaningful PE, but I wanted to differentiate them because these are the three types of variables that most stand out to me when I look at learning. Students should thrive when they learn the content. They should develop positive identities. Because of that, they should learn to value others and work collectively. And this is important. I'm going to emphasize today that teaching involves informed decision-making. This is different than a teacher simply deciding, well, that's not working, I'm going to do something else. A good decision. It's also not different than the decision, it's time to move on. This treats the teacher as a professional. That decision, though, that the teacher makes in how they teach the content and the content they teach can go either way. it can result in ineffective caring gymnasiums or in racialized and oppressive patterns of social, personal, and injustice and harm for students. It's another way to say what I've just said. It's powerful when it's done with care, using professional knowledge, active decision making, and when teaching is meaningful. This notion of teachers making decisions is more than just in the lesson. It occurs before and after the lesson. But I want to pause for a moment and move on to some observations about teaching and teachers that I've observed over my 40-year career in the field. I know I don't look that old, but I am. Some common but very erroneous beliefs about teaching. Teaching is often considered to be not difficult. What that means is that anybody can be teaching, and what that leads to is people with very little professional training becoming teachers. Teaching is best learned through experience. I can tell you that in a study of 385 teachers that I did in China, 5 years out, 10, 15, 25, and I think we went as far as 30 years out, I can't remember if that's true, from their graduation points, they did not learn from an experience. It was a curvilinear relationship. When they were about halfway through their teaching experience, they were at their best, but that best didn't meet any of the criteria that, at least in terms of content knowledge and the teaching of content knowledge, that we would have thought we would like them to have had when they were graduates. So I think just more and more teaching doesn't result in change. I will say that the fundamental variable to help someone gain from experience is the role of reflection. It should be a major outcome of teacher education. There is a belief that teaching depends on creativity and improvisation. I don't think there is any evidence to support that, as I'll talk about in a moment. And there is also the belief that teaching is a natural talent. Some people are just born teachers. Well, I can tell you that I've done a little bit of work with the Defense Department in America. I know that's a terrible thing to perhaps say. And when they look at their lieutenants and captains, they don't find that these people come to the military with the skills they need. They need to train them. This is also true in the coaching field. A lot of people think coaches are born, not made, leaders are born, not made, but this is not true. The few number that get there from experience are exceptional, not the norm. And we waste a lot of talent when we could be training them to acquire the skills that they would need to be able to move forward in lifelong learning in the areas that they're in. Teaching consists of specialized professional knowledge and skill, and that defines the profession. A profession's number one characteristic is that it has knowledge that is not accessible to other folks and required experience and training to do so. Teaching involves using that professional knowledge in decision making. Relying on creativity, experience on the job, and talent has not been shown to serve our students. I will say that in America, we have a program called Teach for America. And this allows you, if you're a graduate of a degree in any area, to apply to teach in schools. They give you a summer of training on classes, and the training is pretty good. And when you look at the first 3 years of those teachers teaching, they don't do well. They are very bright folks, highly committed to working with inner city schools and urban schools and suburban schools, but they don't do well. In fact, they do worse than teachers who are trained in a teacher education program. Interestingly, by about the 4th year, they approach the average of what teachers trained in the teacher education program are able to do. The problem is that those first 3 years, children are not served by very well as these teachers learn on the job and get feedback and whatnot in order to get better. So I'm not sure there's a lot of evidence, as I said, for experience. The other point I'd like to make is that much of what we're doing in teacher education doesn't work, or it doesn't work very well, or it isn't useful. I'll just give you an example. Around the world, very large amounts of the curriculum time is spent on anatomy. I don't know of, putting aside health education and some other areas, I don't know if you can make a convincing argument that knowing the origin and insertion of the rhomboids muscle in the back helps you be a better teacher or coach. I just don't believe that's true. And if you observe teachers closely, you'll never hear them say rhomboids unless they're teaching about anatomy in schools. I know if there are exercise science and kinesiology folks there, you're probably going to start throwing rocks at me, but I have demonstrated this in a number of studies and talked about it extensively, and I think our time to serve teachers could be better spent on helping them understand their why and also the content that is to be learned by children in schools. Teaching is powerful, and I want to talk about what I mean here. This is a normal distribution, and if you teach any group of kids or any adults, you're going to get this distribution. It may not start at 0 and it may not finish at 100, but it's going to be curvilinear, I guess. And most people will get most of what you're getting. You see this very often in universities, in the arts and sciences, where they grade on the curve, but you also see it in teaching. I don't think this is an acceptable outcome if what you're teaching is content that has been defined by the teacher or by a curriculum as what students ought to know, assuming they have the prerequisites to know it. This is not a good outcome of teaching. It is, in fact, I want to suggest, a measure of ineffective teaching. And it doesn't really matter whether this is motor skills, social skills, knowledge. You might measure them differently, it might not be quantitatively, but it's not a good outcome. Instead, I want to suggest you want to have a negatively skewed distribution. Now, what's important about this difference is that the variance you see here is much less than the variance in the normal distribution, and the lowest scoring students on the negatively skewed distribution are typically above the mean of the normal distribution. What does that mean? It means someone at the 50th percentile here is going to be about here at the 80th percentile on the negatively skewed distribution. That's learning, and I'm including males and females, boys and girls in this data. I'm including students with mild disabilities, mild ADHD, mild autism. Not moderate, not severe, that's different. But this represents children who don't feel that they have engagement in physical education. We have very solid data on this from nearly, I think the most common data set with variables in it is about 2,000 students, but we've got a lot more data on that, on individual studies that we've done. It's very clear that this is a possible outcome, and here's the catch: regardless of the conditions, but it requires that teachers are active decision makers and they use their professional knowledge. The other point that I want to talk about from my observations of teachers is that teachers were doing these things long before researchers gave labels to it. In the beginning of my career, I worked very much on peer teaching and peer tutoring, and I used to make the comment that when the wheel was invented back in the day, somebody had to teach somebody else, and Piaget, all of the various developmentalists, cognitivists, behaviorists weren't even born to assign theories to what was going on, and they did a pretty good job because teaching of the wheel survived, as we see today. I want to talk briefly about learning from other subject matters. In America, the largest educational study ever conducted was Project Follow Through. It was 200,000 children in 178 places in America. Kansas City, Cleveland, the Bronx in New York, San Francisco. These were very poor, underserved environments. It was conducted for, I think, 4 years. It may have been 5 years. It assessed 3 basic outcomes: basic skills, reading and math, self-esteem measures, and problem-solving skills. It assessed 22 different educational curriculums. I'm going to be talking about 9 of the best there today. It had long-standing effects. The children in the best of these curriculums, really only one of them, had higher rates of high school graduation, applied to college and college acceptance, and they did as well as on average as other students in college. What's very important about this is none of the curriculums assessed their performance of the children or the teachers in the schools. It was independently assessed by a group called ABT Associates, and they had no association with any curriculum model. So let me explain the graph here. This is the dark blue is the basic academic skills. The light blue is the problem solving, and this is the self-esteem. And you can see that of the 9 curriculum models, this is the one you want your child in. The others, you might feel really good with the self-esteem, but not so, well, actually, not so good for problem solving and basic instruction. This black line is really important because it's the measure against which all of the models were compared, and it represents the control group, or if you like, typical teaching. So the first point I want to make here is that this model, which was a direct instruction model, not the kind most of you would be familiar with, but it has similar characteristics, was superior on all 3 approaches. All 3 variables, sorry, by a standard. This is about 1.5 standard deviations. Pretty significant. The blue is about 2 standard deviations here. The rest were, and these are about 1 to 2 standard deviations, worse than what teachers were doing. So some models are better than others, but teachers were doing better than most of the models. Self-esteem was highly correlated with competence in math and reading and problem solving. I think you can visually see that here. Really important component. If you're pretty good at it, you're probably going to feel that you're pretty good at it if you're doing enough, if you're engaged in it enough. And finally, the teachers were the benchmarks. This line here represents the teachers, and as I said, they didn't do too badly here. They were not as good as these models. There was lots of room for improvement. But my point is that when we do professional development, we often go in and assume that we've got something to give teachers. We should first look to see how good the teachers actually are. And I think I have observed this over and over again in studies. Oops. So how can teachers leverage their power to impact their students? Judy Rink, an American physical educator, has on the first page of her book, Teaching Physical Education for Learning, just 3 words: teaching is purposeful. And my interpretation of that is teachers must be intentional in their teaching. And this is a fundamental belief of meaningful PE. If we return to Tim Fletcher's abstract, we'll see that he talks about being explicit and intentional use of meaningful experiences, planful experiences. This isn't done on the fly while you're teaching. It's planful. You've prepared for it ahead of time. So what does being intentional mean? I just want to talk a little bit about this. Professional development is important. A few years ago, Hans van der Maas and I spoke to teacher educators, and we asked them, I think, 8 or 9 contemporary issues in teacher education, practice-based teacher education, things like social emotional learning, core practices in teacher education and so on. And we asked them two questions. One, how many of them were familiar with it? Most of them said they weren't, but they had heard of these before. And how many of them were using them in their programs? It was about 100 teachers, I think, at the time or so. And we were really shocked, as were the teachers, that they didn't know that, teacher educators, they didn't know this. I have done the same sort of questioning with teachers. Are they aware of instructional models, etc.? They have not, which is one of my primary arguments that the best professional development is under your own control, doing it yourself, attending conferences as you are today. And I think this is as true for teacher educators as it is for teachers. Oh, I do want to suggest that this is not a phenomenon of physical education. It is also a phenomenon of most educational programs. My own university, I think there are probably 5 or 6 teacher education programs that are aware of the concept of practice-based teacher education, or core teaching practices, or they're all, I think, aware of social emotional learning and variable and models like that. A way to think about aligning your model. Back in 1987, David Cohen came up with a concept called instructional alignment, and he basically said, look, what you want to occur ought to be highly related to your assessment, and then you need to teach to that end. It's been my experience that teachers don't do much assessments. If they do assessments, they kind of make them up on the fly or towards the end of the instruction. What Cohen demonstrated is, if you think of the curves I just showed you before, a normal curve and a negatively skewed a curve from instruction, this aligning your goals and your instruction with your goals and assessing what you want, this is called instructional alignment, and it produces, all other things being equal, fairly significant gains in student learning, as much as 1 to 2 sigma. The gains are really significant, typically because the control groups aren't doing any of these things, and it's a bit of a free-for-all. So it's good when I said that you should be planful for meaningful learning, that you do your planning before you start teaching, that it's heavily, that preparation is high on the role of the teacher. And the metaphor I would use for this is drawing an arrow back on a bow. The further you pull the bow back, the further the arrow will travel. Of course, if you pull it back too far, you break the string. There are very many ways of teaching that produce the learning outcomes I've been talking about. Here are some I know from my own teaching and research, and I just want to be clear, these are things that I've actually done as a teacher and as a teacher educator and seen my students do, and I've researched. They are not a comprehensive list. There are also massive variations on this, and I also want to remind you that I'm a very strong supporter of teachers doing what they are confident they know and can do, as long as that's encapsulated, I guess, in a process of reflection and improvement. So when we talk about class management, we know from our teacher education textbooks that rules and routines are important. What is particularly important when they're taught is that they are rehearsed by students. Often rules and routines don't tend to work because students didn't have a chance to practice them. We didn't think about rules and routines as skills that teachers need to acquire. I know that seems really obvious, but it is the fundamental reason I've seen management start off poorly by pre-service teachers and even by teachers. Generally speaking, when you look at the literature, teachers leave the field of teaching within the first 3 to 5 years, and one of the most common reasons is because they didn't like the kids. They couldn't control their children. I know I'm using the word control, but they didn't have control over the classroom. The other reason, of course, is they're not really supported, they're not really in good environments. But this represents 40 of every 100 students that graduate from universities in the United States, and I feel moderately confident that this is true elsewhere in the world, though I haven't seen that data. The good behavior game is simply the most researched, best management system I've seen at any grade level from preschool to college. It darn well works quickly, and it works for most children reasonably effectively. I've used it in classrooms where it was what we call reverse mainstreaming, where the majority of children had ADHD and mild autism. It's not going to work anywhere near as well with moderate or severe autism or moderate or severe ADHD, but it's a very good class-wide system. If you aren't aware of it, I'd look it up. As I've said, I think any instructional model works well if the teacher's committed to doing it. I've seen very effective outcomes in all of these models, and I've seen just terrible outcomes in all of these models, and in each and every case it came down to the teacher, not the model. And so I think we need to make sure teachers know why they're doing what they're doing, and that they view themselves as learners of their students' learning. The number one reason why these typically aren't sustained is because teachers expect them to work from the get-go. In the Siegentop Sport Education book, they make the case that the model should be introduced incrementally. Nothing wrong with going full bore, but they suggest that for beginning teachers or teachers using it for the first time, it might be a little much to do everything. And I agree with that. I know that Kent State University and Ohio State University have been promoting teaching games for understanding at Kent State and sport education at Ohio State for more than 30 years. And there are very few teachers using these models in schools. They get trained very well, but the conditions and the lack of continuing support across that time are the explanations why any of these models don't survive. But when teachers are committed and they've done their own homework, and they, whether it was at a professional or informal professional development, these things tend to survive much better. I don't know this for a fact. I've been chasing Tom McKenzie for years to get this data, but I suspect the same is true of the Spark programs. They may not survive as long as people think, and one reason is the lack of ongoing support, although I will admit, if you're into physical activity and that's your major goal, the Spark programs do it better than most. What works for assessment? Well, first of all, you should assess what you teach, and what you teach should be highly related to your goals. You should focus on ongoing assessment across a single unit and across multiple units. Some of the skills you want students to achieve, like social outcomes, knowledges, might not be able to be attained in a single unit. Oh, yes, I'll come back to that. And you ought to be focused on real indicators of learning in various domains. And I'll give you an example. Dribbling is used in soccer and basketball all over the world as a measure of student learning. But dribbling is not a key skill in those sports. If I look at basketball dribbling, the fundamental premise in basketball is there's a defender, the player with the ball, and the ball is to the side or behind the player. I don't think dribbling is assessed that way anywhere in the United States. It's simply, can you dribble through cones? And, you know, when you're playing basketball, cones don't come at you. You want a defensive, offensive, real, what is commonly called authentic approach, either measured in games or in modified game scenarios. So the other thing about dribbling, and when I say it's not a critical skill in basketball, when I teach basketball and soccer, dribbling isn't something I teach initially. it's one of the most difficult skills for children to learn. I teach them to pass the ball, trap the ball, catch the ball in basketball and softball, and make it a passing and shooting game long before I introduce dribbling into the mix. And dribbling is typically done in every warm-up, but it's a passing shooting game. I can get into tactics on the first day of instruction that way. As I said, I'm no basketball instructor, but I do teach soccer reasonably well. My main take-home messages here is I think a case has been and has been made over the last 10 years and by different people talking about meaningfulness in both teaching and learning and now in meaningful PE, that it makes a significant contribution to our perspective on PE. If for no other reason, it focuses our attention on what it means to be a good teacher, because we don't often say that in our literature. I don't know of any study I've seen that says, we want teachers to be caring, we want teachers to be, to develop their students' social emotional characteristics, we want learning to occur, we want students to have knowledge, and yes, we want them to be physically active. What I see is arguments in favor of one or the other of those things at the detriment to others. And if you're a physical education teacher, you just can't ignore those other issues if you want students to engage in the activity you're teaching. And I go back to my position on what I believe the content of physical education ought to be. Using meaningful PE requires intentionality. What does this mean? The fundamental behavior here is to be planful about what you're going to teach and to understand it may not survive contact with the students. You may have to modify, and you always do have to modify, what you're teaching, how you're teaching it, because it doesn't go well despite your best planning and knowledge of the students. And my third take home, I think everybody agrees with this, is there is no one way to be an effective teacher. There are some very wrong ways to do it, but many curriculums and instructional methods can be used as a key variable by the teacher. But teachers who are reflective and active in their professional development, as you saw on the project follow-through data, don't do too badly. And we need to acknowledge the strength of what teachers do. I'm going to stop here. I don't know, we started a bit late. I don't know if I've got time to questions, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have. And I thank you for taking the time to listen. No problem. If you have questions, my email address is there. You're very welcome to send me an email. I'm happy to chat with you about it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moore. Maybe just one question if our audience has, or I'm waiting their question. I think there is no question, or if they need, maybe they can email.
Perfectly fine.
Thank you very much.
Always good to chat with you folks. Take care, everybody.
Değerli hocalarım, ara veremiyoruz ne yazık ki. Biraz süreyi açtık. O nedenle diğer araştırmacımıza geçiyorum.
Geçen geçti zaten. O yazıyor yani. Görüntü de açmıyor.
ben yaptığım için burası aynı kanalla içeri onun kulağına gitmiyor maalesef. Onun için sesi birazcık takmak zorunda kalıyor. Siz oranın sesini hem buradan hem oradan çekiyoruz. Duymak şansı buradaki sesler olduğu için çeviriyorum. Buranın sesini kısarsak bu sefer çevirmen duymuyor. Çevireceği ses duymadığı için
Çeviriyor canlı yayından. Yok gene gidiyorum işte. Ya şuranın sesi bizimkinden mi? Buranın sesini merak ediyorum. Yani şu an bunu alıyorum. İyi ki yok şu an. Bu ne lan?
Can you hear me? Yes. You can also draw all your presentation on your PowerPoint presentation.
Sesi artırınca çeviri sesi duyamıyoruz. Buradan duyduğunu çeviriyor. Kuzu iki farklı oturum var şu an.
Sesle ilgili durumda benim de anlayamadığım biraz şey var. Evet, mikrofonda biraz sorun var ama.
Duymazsa
Evet, bunu tabii. O zaman Deirdre
oturmam mı?
NICHROININ kendisi İrlanda'da özellikle anlamlı beden eğitimi konularında önemli çalışma olan bir akademisyen. Özellikle beden eğitimi öğretimi, öğretmenlik alanında, öğretmen değerlendirilmesi, öğretim konularında uzman bir kişi kendisi. Şu anda Immaculate College'da İrlanda'da çalışıyor. Kendisinden bugün kapsayıcılığı teşvik etmek ve çeşitliliği hesaba katmak için anlamlı beden eğitimini kullanmak isimli çalışmasını dinleyeceğiz. Sonrasında süremizin yeterli durumuna göre değerli hocalarım sorular alabilirim.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for giving me this invitation to speak with you today. And thank you to Fatih for all these years of communication about your conference. I hope that you are all having a good conference. I'm conscious that it's near the end of the day. So I hope that what I share with you is interesting and you learn at the conference. So today I'm going to speak to you on the topic of using meaningful physical education to promote. Can you hear me?
Actually, we have a problem for hearing your voice.
Hello?
Can you please check your microphone? Maybe your microphone is...
Okay.
Onu çıkartıp konuşsun direkt.
Do you have a headset? Maybe you can only talk to
Yeah.
your microphone.
Is that better? No? This one? Can you hear me now?
No, the problem is
Okay.
very difficult to listen to you because when you talk about
Okay.
problem about
Okay. Let me try to change the setting and see if this is good.
Do you have a chance to...
Is that better?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Do you chance to use your laptop or computer's microphone instead of your headset?
Yeah, hold on one second. I'll take this out.
Maybe it's a better way.
Is that better?
Again, please.
Does that work?
No, it's same.
No?
Same again.
If by this, is that better? No?
We are trying to fix this problem. Sorry about the wait.
Yeah, it's no problem.
Are you using your computer's microphone now?
Yes, right now I'm using the computer. Yeah.
Aslında biraz düzeldi.
Does that work? Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me? No? Yeah.
I can hear you now, yeah.
Yeah.
WhatsApp'tan arayabilir miyim? WhatsApp'tan arayıp tutacağız. Konuşsun size. Tamam, oradan arıyorsanız da fark edin.
Atacağım, telefonla mikrofon da.
O iyi bir çözüm olabilir.
Öyle daha rahat.
Dr. Brennan, what is calling you now from the WhatsApp? He's calling you from WhatsApp. He's calling from WhatsApp. He will try to explain you. He's calling you from WhatsApp. Thank you very much. Sorry about this problem. Hocam sen beni arasana. Hocam siz yani bizden kaynaklanan buradan kaynaklanan bir sıkıntı karşı tarafın sanırım laptopunda ya da çalıştığı bilgisayarla ilgili bir problem var. Mikrofonunda da Hakkı hocamın mikrofonunu görmeyi denedi ama yine ses çok iyi geliyor. Yani şu an bu mikrofonu değiştirmek çalışıyorum. Farklı bir teknoloji WhatsApp görüşmesi şeklinde bir dinlemeye çalışacağız şu an.
Yansıyı verebilecek mi?
Hocam yansımaya devam etmesini isteyeceğiz orada. Buranın sesini kapatıp WhatsApp'tan konuşması buradan sizlere duyurmaya çalışacağım. Onu da yapacağız.
Ya da kendi telefonundan Zoom'a ikinci bir proje olarak bağlanacak. Mikrofon olarak kendi telefonunu kullanıyor. Çünkü mikrofondan kaynaklı bir. Evet. İnsanların da- Yok. Tam telefonuyla girecek. Umarım olur. Tamam hocam. Şu anda bağlandığınız yerin bilgisini kapatırız. Telefona bağlandığınız mikrofonla gelir. Hocam nereye basarak açıyoruz şeyi? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly. Değil mi? Okay. Thank you very much hocam. Ona göre çok daha iyi bir ses geldi.
Thank you very much. We are listening to you now.
Okay, brilliant. And I'm going to share my screen. Does that work now if I do this?
Yes, yes.
Okay, brilliant. Let's try again. And apologies, I don't know what the technical problem is, but it is good that we're talking to each other. Thank you to the conference and to Fatih for this invitation to speak. Today I will be talking to you about using meaningful physical education to promote inclusion and account for diversity. The project that I'm going to tell you about is part of a larger project that Professor Tim Fletcher and myself have been involved in for more than 10 years now. And right now, this project around meaningful PE has teachers working in Canada, in both Ontario and Alberta, teachers working in Brazil, Portugal with Marcus Godoy, and teachers working in Europe as part of an Erasmus Plus project that I'm going to tell you about. So the project that I'm going to tell you about is called Champions of Inclusion and Diversity Using Meaningful Physical Education in Primary Schools. And for short, we call it the CHAMP project. And this is an Erasmus Plus funded program that is now in year 3 of a 3-year project. The overall objective, so what we're trying to achieve in the CHAMP project, is to try and learn about how to support elementary or primary teachers to implement meaningful PE that is inclusive and accounts for the diversity of the student population. So the way that we are trying to figure this out is through a collaboration between primary teachers and teacher educators to develop evidence and to develop evidence-based resources to share. And our overall ambition, or vision for the project is that every child in Europe can have meaningful PE experiences that are inclusive and attend equitably to the diversity of the student population. So the project, just to give you a little bit of information to get a sense of it, the project is happening in 5 different European countries. And in each country, there are a number of teachers that we call champions. And the way we define a champion is that these are teachers who know about, successfully implement, and advocate and share their experiences of meaningful PE. So the champion teachers in each country are contributing to gathering evidence, to dissemination, and to multiplier events to support other teachers to implement meaningful PE. The model that we have used in the CHAMP project, talking to Fatih, he thought that this might be something that would be of interest in the Turkish context. So just to explain a little bit of how it works. So for example, in Spain, there is one teacher educator and there are 3 teachers. So the teacher educator and the teachers work closely together, and the teacher educator supports the teachers. And then sometimes everybody comes together in sharing meetings where the Spanish teachers hear from the teachers in the other countries and the teacher educators in the other countries. So right now in the project, we have teachers and teacher educators from Ireland, from Spain, from Norway, from Denmark, and from North Macedonia. And we also have 3 expert partners. Tim Fletcher from Canada, who is at your conference and I know has presented to you about meaningful PE, and 2 experts in Ireland, one related to inclusion and diversity and one related to the professional development of teachers. So to explain to you what the teachers did and what they are doing now, in the first year of the project, the teachers engaged in online training for 12 hours. So across 6 months, they came online for 2 hours each month, and then they took those ideas and they tried them out in their practice. In each of those 2-hour sessions, there would be an opportunity for expert inputs, opportunities for breakout where they discuss the ideas either with their colleagues in their own country or with other teachers, and opportunities to ask questions and to discuss the ideas, everybody together. Once this initial training was completed, for the next 18 months, the teachers are implementing ideas related to meaningful PE. They're supported by the teacher educator in their own country, and they're also supported by project sharing meetings where all 5 countries come together to share their ideas. The teachers are writing blog posts about their implementation and pedagogical cases about specific things that happened and how they played out. Teachers are also starting to share their learning with other teachers in their country in conferences within their own country and in special dedicated CPD sessions. Alongside this implementation, there's also some evidence gathering through data collection. So the teachers are participating in interviews and observations to get a sense of what is happening across the different countries. So the key concepts that are driving the project relate to inclusion and diversity. The first concept is equity, and we define this as ensuring that there is a concern with fairness, such that the education of all learners is of equal importance. So for us, this means paying attention to the quality of all children's experiences within physical education. And part of the starting point for the project was that currently some children may not be counted the same as others, or may be discounted for different reasons in PE. The second concept is diversity. And what we mean here really is the difference between people. And this can relate to things like their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, the language they use, their culture, their religion, their mental or physical ability, their class, or their immigration status. And we think of diversity as a wheel where all these different aspects of someone intersect in different ways and influence situations that play out in physical education. The third concept that we're talking about is inclusion. And here we use a definition from the Canadian literature, where at a basic level, inclusion is an all-embracing idea. Everyone matters, and everyone matters equally, and should be treated as such. And this idea of inclusion, when we look at the physical education literature, the UNESCO Quality PE guidelines state that an inclusive approach should have inbuilt flexibility that enables adjustment to different needs, ensures that everyone benefits from a commonly agreed level of quality education, and gives the teacher freedom to adapt their working methods to achieve maximum impact and relevance in their specific classroom situation. So these were the three concepts that were guiding us. And alongside these concepts, the teachers were implementing the ideas of meaningful physical education. Now, I know that Tim Fletcher has already talked to you about meaningful physical education, so I won't repeat all of that detail. Instead, I'm going to highlight where we think diversity and inclusion opportunities might be presented. So the project started with the assumption that there is an opportunity within the ideas of meaningful PE to promote inclusion and diversity. For example, democratic approaches, when children are included in decisions about their participation, then it's likely that we will find ways for them to be more included. Similarly, when children are helped to make sense of their experiences, they're more likely to take ownership of them, invest, continue to participate, and shape those future experiences. So it is the responsiveness of these student-centered pedagogies that hold potential to create a more inclusive and equitable PE environment. In this project, the CHAMP project, the teachers explored how these meaningful PE pedagogies, both democratic and reflective, could be put to work specifically to promote a more inclusive and equitable experience for the children in PE. It's important to note that the teachers in our project were mostly very experienced teachers of physical education who would already say that their practice was inclusive and that they did account for diversity in different ways. What this project offered the opportunity of was to look again at those pedagogies and to draw specifically on reflective and democratic approaches to see how they might influence how children experienced physical education. So the framework of pedagogies that we used to organize the project was based around two key approaches to teaching. The first was about being reactive. So being reactive relates to a situation where the teacher sees something playing out that is not inclusive or does not account for diversity, and they change or they adapt what is happening based on what they see. The other side of, or the other approach, being proactive, means getting ahead of these situations, anticipating or predicting how things might play out, and taking steps in advance so this scenario or this situation does not arise. So proactive approaches can relate to creating a policy or sometimes building a culture, so establishing norms of inclusive practice, how children are grouped, how decisions are made in the class. So diversifying learning means including children and goes beyond just making it accessible. It involves embracing inclusion, so the system or the culture is in place that celebrates individuality, diversity, and ability, rather than reacting to things as they happen. Now I'm going to share with you some examples of how this might play out and what it might look like in practice. So first, in terms of democratic pedagogies, we see 5 ways that meaningful PE ideas can create a more inclusive environment that accounts for diversity. I am going to speak to 3 of these to give you a sense of what I mean. First, in terms of building authentic relationships. So for us, authentic relationships are the foundation. And the relational aspect is critical to the meaningful PE approach. And when we look at the relationship building, there are strategies a teacher can use that are reactive, and there are strategies that are proactive. So in terms of being reactive, we can think about the teacher observing the children during the lesson, noticing what do the children enjoy, what do they not enjoy, and amplify the parts that are working. Secondly, the teacher might notice who is struggling with the task and make adjustments to the child's needs. So in both these situations, the teacher is observing and reacting to try and make the experience work better for children in the class. Getting ahead of that situation, so being proactive, might be prioritizing the one-on-one positive relationships among the children, selecting and planning, like Phillip was talking about, the content that will work in the first place, and then building in flexible success criteria so the child who might struggle has access to success. The second example is around building a feeling of belonging. And this feeling of belonging matters. Everyone should feel they belong, and everyone should have the opportunity to participate at a level that is appropriate for them. So in terms of being reactive, an example of this could be intervening to promote that sense of belonging and rapport among the children. And also intervening when you see examples of there not being a sense of belonging to promote it. And secondly, being consistent in promoting a culture of fair play and belonging. Being proactive in regards to that feeling of belonging could include planning, so lessons are based on principles of diversity, irrespective of the population of children in your class. And using inclusive language that presumes the diversity of children and their families, ensuring that everyone feels like their identities and families belong and are equally reflected in school life. Thirdly, autonomy supportive pedagogies. So again, we can be reactive and we can be proactive. So reactive approaches could be letting the children choose some of the activities when they make suggestions, providing a range of activities that the children choose from, even if they want to do the same one every week, and letting the children decide when to switch between activities. Getting ahead of this to allow children to be autonomy supportive, proactively build children's vocabulary using the features of meaningful experiences, and build the children's capacity to make those choices. So dialogue is critical to the children taking ownership and responsibility for their involvement. And this is where we suggest starting small, because too much choice can be overwhelming. Scaffolding children's choices and decision-making processes, offering them choices, can be empowering and can promote their investment in participation. And ownership of their learning is motivating, and it helps them to care about what's happening, make an effort, and persist. So I've shown you 3 examples of how teachers can be reactive and proactive in relation to being democratic in their classroom. Similarly now, I would like to share some examples of how we can use meaningful PE ideas in relation to reflective pedagogies. Again, we have included a framework of 5 pedagogies, but today I am just going to speak to you about 2 of them. First, the idea of supporting children's goal setting. Being reactive, we can share your lesson objectives and ask for feedback and input from the children on the spot. And at the end of the lesson, you can review those objectives and together identify next steps. Being proactive, getting ahead of it, might involve the use of individualized learning contracts or combining individual personalized goals with class-level collective goals that all the children can buy into. This can build a collective sense of togetherness and belonging. Secondly, and really importantly, central to the meaningful PE framework, the idea of supporting children to reflect back on their participation experiences. Being reactive here can include, for example, giving the children prompts at the end of their lesson, like what I liked most, what I didn't like, one thing I would change about today, or I am proud of, or feeling good about, and asking the children to finish those sentences. Being proactive about involving them in reflection could include using a variety of different means of representation, using flexible criteria so that they can reflect on what is important to them, and building that culture of openness to promote feedback. Finally, in terms of teacher reflection, we think in session, the teacher reflecting in action, observing the children, listening to the children, asking the children, is this working? And then post-session, we think of the teacher maybe keeping a reflective diary or reflective voice notes about how things are going, maybe asking a parent for feedback or chatting with a PE colleague. And then finally, at the end of the term, considering that big question, are the children I teach having meaningful experiences in PE? I'd briefly like to share with you the story of one of our champion teachers who shared his story in a blog post recently. So this is Mesudi. He is one of the champion teachers in North Macedonia, and he wrote a blog about getting started with meaningful PE, which is on our website at that link. He explained that his starting point to get involved was that he realized that many students felt disconnected from PE due to its focus on performance rather than personal growth. Mesudi chose a number of actions to test and try and make his practice more inclusive. First, he tried to encourage autonomy by empowering students to take charge of some of the decisions within physical activities. Secondly, he tried to increase the variety of physical activities to ensure all students found something that they loved. Thirdly, he tried to promote positive social interaction And fourthly, he tried to move away from a competitive approach towards an emphasis on enjoyment and personal growth. And ultimately, he was trying to make PE a welcoming space for everybody. In his blog, Methody shares some of the challenges that he faced too. The challenge of changing the mindset of students who were accustomed to a different type of PE where competition was prioritised. He found it challenging to reduce the emphasis on results and competition, but he felt it was important because this was excluding some of his students. He added more uncompetitive challenges and tried to shift to this focus on personally relevant learning. And he tried to embrace fun and democratic practices, but he recognised that sometimes the logistical limitations related to resources and facilities blocked his progress. Methody is one of our champion stories, but their blog posts and the cases they have written are all available on the LAMP website, and maybe reading some of their stories might be helpful to you in thinking about what these ideas might look like in practice in your school or in your community. So I have some takeaway messages for you to think about. The first message is that the findings of our project suggest that combining democratic and reflective pedagogies together created a more inclusive version of PE. The champion teachers in the CHAMP project drew on both. So they used both democratic and reflective pedagogies together in different amounts based on the class that they were teaching and what the class needed. We saw examples where they used student voice to shape activities, where they tried to change activities and introduce novelty to make it more enjoyable. They tried to foster autonomy, and they tried to embed reflection. We suggest that the framework presented on this slide of using democratic and reflective pedagogies together is one way that you as a teacher can analyze the inclusivity of your practice and also identify actions that you can take up and use in your practice. Our second takeaway is that meaningful PE involves a balancing act between the individual and the collective. And we suggest that dialogue, conversation between the teacher and the children, and between children together, is at the heart of meaningful PE. Meaningful PE encourages the teacher to pay attention to the quality of experience for individual children. But that needs to be reconciled with the collective experience of the group. So we suggest that a balance between individual and collective momentum is needed in making decisions together. My third takeaway message is that we see value in both reactive and proactive approaches. Both of these have a role to play in promoting an inclusive physical education that accounts for diversity. Being reactive presents that opportunity for problem solving, for fixing things as we see them, as we notice, as we observe, as they come to our attention. But there's also a role for looking at the culture, at the systems, at the structures and the policies and the approaches that we take to be proactive to ensure that all children have that opportunity to find meaningful experiences in physical education. Finally, we see potential in using reactive and proactive approaches with meaningful PE at a number of levels. So it might be one teacher, it might be one school, one district, or even one country. But we suggest starting small and introducing the meaningful PE ideas first. When teachers are comfortable with the ideas of meaningful PE, then there is the opportunity to build momentum by looking at being reactive and using the features of meaningful PE and the democratic and reflective approaches to react to what is happening to make PE more inclusive and account for diversity. And finally, when there is momentum, there is the potential to look proactively at the structures, at the culture, and at the policies to ensure that the version of PE that is being implemented is at its heart inclusive and accounts for diversity. Finally, I share with you the website of Meaningful PE and the LinkedIn of Tim Fletcher and myself, Deirdre NICHROININ. If you want to follow us, then most of the new materials, so the cases, the slide decks, the papers that will come from the CHAMP project will all be shared at these locations. And you can also, of course, get in touch with us if you would like access to any of the other information. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I know it is near the end of your day and the technology problems don't help us to stay motivated, but I hope what I've shared might be interesting to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curran. I enjoyed your speech and also your presentation. Let me shortly explain your presentation to our audience, and after that, if any questions, I will let you know. That's the way.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Değerli katılımcılar, teşekkür ederiz. Gerçekten güzel bir Erasmus projesini sundu kendisi bize. Dünyanın farklı ülkelerinden yapılmış. Önemli bulgular anlamlandırılmış beden eğitimini çok iyi açıkladığını düşünüyorum kendi adıma. Sizlerin de eğer sunumla ilgili merak ettiğiniz, sormak istediğiniz konular, sorular varsa...
Ben sorabilir miyim? Evet.
Buyurun hocam. Dr. Cronin, you have a question?
Ben önce Türkçe söyleyeyim. Aslında farklı kültür ve ülkelerde öğretmenlerle çalışıyor anlamlı beden eğitimini. Burada bu kültür ya da ülkeden bağımsız olarak öğretmenlerin ortak olarak benimsedikleri en önemli nokta ne? Anlamlı beden eğitimi için. Ve en önemli gördükleri zorluk ne? My question is about, actually, I'm just trying to focus on the culture and the country. So you have had a very impactful project. So what are the things, actually what is the one thing that the teachers embrace positively about meaningful PE and the challenge they have had in common regardless the country or the culture?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat to make sure I understand the question correctly. You're asking across the different countries in the project, was there common successes and common challenges? Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Yes, correct.
Oh, perfect. So across the 5 countries, initially all of the teachers were a little bit unsure because the teachers wanted to see the ideas in practice. And in the online training, we talked about the ideas and we share examples of the ideas, but it's not the same as seeing it in practice. So this was a little struggle we had in that the teachers initially wanted like a formula of do this, then do this, then do this. But meaningful PE, the foundation of it is in the teacher's vision and what is important in the context. So it is a very flexible framework, but when the teachers were starting something new, they didn't want this flexibility, they wanted to follow a formula more. So at the beginning, for all the teachers, they started with the features of meaningful PE. So they picked one. Most of them picked fun. And they said, okay, I'm just going to try and work on making it more fun. And when that was working, they added a second feature. So for all the teachers, the success or the way in at the beginning was based on the features. And trying to make the features of fun, social interaction, and for some of the teachers, challenge, work better in the context. So this was the common success across all the teachers. And probably the challenge was that as they began to use the democratic pedagogies and the reflective pedagogies, it actually looked different in each school, not just in each country, but in each school. But the common across all the teachers was that they saw the difference it made for the children in their class. So maybe the focus was on one child or a group of children, but they were able to clearly identify the difference and the improvement it had made for specific children in their classes, who were more included than they had been before. And this was their big driver and their motivation to keep going in the project, because they could see that the changes they were making in their practice was having a direct positive influence on including children in their classes.
Thank you very much.
Ben şimdi kısaca bir cevaplarını söylersem hadi ya. Ben sadece kendime saklamıştım. Gerçekten mi? Evet. Tamam. Tamam. Tamam. Çok kısaca özetliyorum. Aslında yani sadece kültürler ve ülkeler arasında bir fark. Buna hazırlık değilim. Gerçekten teşekkür ederim bu bana attığınız için. Bugün Berkcan'ın neler yaşadığını şu an çok iyi anlıyorum. İşte karma denen şeyi bu kadar hızlı yaşamıyor olmalıydım. Ancak şöyle, aslında çok hızlı özetleyeceğim, kusuruma bakmayın çünkü her şeyi takip etmenin az sonra diğer etkinlikleri düşünüyordum. David'in çevirisini falan düşünüyordum. Neyse. Aslında sadece kültürler arası, ülkeler arası değil, okullar arası da bir fark olduğunu uygulamalarda aslında Sabah Tim'in de sözüne ettiği gibi bu en büyük zorluklardan bir tanesi olduğunu, öğretmenlerin daha çok pratik uygulamalar konusunda bir beklenti içerisinde olduklarını doğrudan uygulamalara aktarma konusunda, ki biz bunu TÜBED'de de tüm etkinliklerde yaşıyoruz, hızlıca spor salonlarına aktarabilecekleri şeyler arıyorlar ve anlamlı beden eğitiminin öğelerinden en çok eğlenceyi tercih ettiklerini söyledi. Özetleyecek olursam. Teşekkürler Erhan Hocam.
Var mı değerli hocalarım, değerli katılımcı? Edeyim bir daha. Thank you very much. This is great speech and presentation.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to thank everybody in the audience. I know it is